This episode of Trifles is brought to you by the Baker Street Journal, the leading publication of Sherlock Holmes scholarship since 1946. Find them online at bakerstreetirregulars.com. Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the circle was red, the study was scarlet, and the Scot was glorious, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
You know the plots, but what about the minutiae? Have you ever stopped to wonder about the giant rat of Sumatra, the remarkable worm unknown to science, or the repulsive story of the red leech?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 205, The Setting of Cornwall. Hello and welcome to Trifles once again, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we look into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
Burt, are you ready to travel?
I am. I've got my passport and my Chaldean Archivist guidebook.
Oh, perfect. I'm going to need a translator. I don't know if Google Translate does Chaldean to English.
Well, if it doesn't, now is the time.
Well, I may need to kind of jury rig it, go Chaldean to Latin, Latin to English, and circumvent the thing. So, well, anyway, if you would like to get the show notes to this episode, they are available at ihose.co/trifles205. That'll take you directly to our website, SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. There you can sort through some of our archives. You can also get our archives on any of the podcast platforms that you may listen to us on. But you can also subscribe to us via email. We don't want you to miss a single episode of Trifles. We come out every week, every Wednesday throughout the year. That's 52 episodes a year. Such a bargain for you. It is free to subscribe. But if you would like to support us, we will give you all sorts of bonuses, rewards, trinkets, tchotchkes, etc. over on Patreon. So just hit that support or become a patron button on any of the posts that you see on our website. And we will appreciate anything that you do for us. For as little as $1 a month, it helps to keep the lights on here, and it also will contribute towards where we're going in 2021, which is to create a more cohesive online community for all Trifle supporters, places where we can discuss things in more detail, where you can give us ideas for the show, and we can all connect with each other. So make sure you check that out. And now, let's get on board and head down to Cornwall. Well, Burt, to kind of get us in the mood here, you are a leader with one of the Sherlockian groups called the Cornish Horrors. How appropriate that we're going to spend some time in Cornwall then. Why don't you kind of get us in the mood with, well, what I know is one of the traditions at the Cornish Horrors?
It's a toast written by one of our late and very much lamented members, Les Daniels, who was an author and screenwriter, who wrote this some years ago, and we do it at every Cornish Horrors meeting. It's called Cornwall's Secluded Coast. The wise mariner stands far out from that evil place, where blind fear marks a woman's frozen face. Was she frightened by a demon or a ghost that crept along Cornwall's secluded coast? Something moves among the bushes in the dark, and 3 are stricken senseless with no mark. To what inhuman thing did they play host at night upon Cornwall's secluded coast? Black cliffs and ancient ruins mark the place where the master solved his strangest case and found a drug more menacing than most, imported to Cornwall's secluded coast. The atmosphere is stuffy in the room, and even heroes contemplate their doom when Devil's Foot root powder starts to roast in flames along Cornwall's secluded coast. The greatest horrors lurk inside the mind, but podcasts sometimes help the mind unwind. So, fellow triflers, let us drink a toast in honor of Cornwall's secluded coast.
I like that. I don't remember the podcast line at my last Cornish Horrors meeting.
Well, Les was very far-thinking. This is a second draft that he did.
What a guy. What a guy. Well, I think that sets us up nicely because it not only captures a story in which Cornwall figured prominently, but it also gives us a sense of the geography. You know, we've traveled to Agra in previous episodes. We've traveled to Dartmoor I think in the September lineup for settings. And Dartmoor and Cornwall are really not that far apart. They're adjacent to each other. As one heads west out of London, the Great Western Railway will take you through Dartmoor and then turning a little bit southwest, that'll take you down to the Cornish coast. Now, I think it was our friend David Hammer, the late BSI. He wrote a whole series of travelogues going through England, and he gave us a fairly apt description of Cornwall as he was on his travelogue doing the Southwest. He went through Dartmoor and then motored down to Cornwall. And he said there's something indefinably unruly and unconquered about Cornwall. It's among the wettest areas in the UK, which is no small feat, with rain and sea mist responsible for abundantly green vegetation in areas protected from the sea. Cornwall extends like a dagger into the vitals of the Atlantic, which in turn lashes it remorselessly. It's a rocky area, granite hard, with an irregular rocky coast deeply indented by the depredations of the sea. Man has long been here, as his barrows and tumuli testify, and Cornish tin was mined for Bronze Age Phoenicians who sailed there regularly to trade for it. There remain none who still speak Cornish, a Celtic tongue akin to Welsh and Breton, but the language abounds in place names throughout the country. What?
Well, that's lovely. It's a very good summary. Cornwall is mentioned 6 times in the canon, actually beyond the Devil's Foot adventure. It's usually a troubled area. We hear about Cornwall first in the Red-Headed League, where John Clay is described, I think by Athelney Jones. He's described as a murderer, thief, smasher, and forger who will crack a crib in Scotland one week and be raising money to build an orphanage in Cornwall the next. And then when we get to Black Peter, we have a character whose family was concerned with a bank failure that ruined half of the county families of Cornwall. But when you get to Devil's Foot, you get these wonderful descriptions by Watson, where he's telling you this 13 years after the event, and he says, I've gotten my notes out so I can give you the exact details. But he says, scattered towers marked the villages which dotted this part of Cornwall. The nearest of these was the hamlet of Tredannick Wallace, where the cottages of a couple of hundred inhabitants clustered around an ancient, moss-grown church. So we're in a small cottage near Poldhu Bay at the farther extremity of the Cornish peninsula. And that actual extremity is Lizard Point, and it's the southernmost tip of England. The westernmost point of Cornwall is Land's End. But just north of Lizard Point lies Poldhu Cove, which is not called Poldhu Bay, but Poldhu Cove. And Watson tells us we look down upon the whole sinister semicircle of Mounts Bay, that old death trap of sailing vessels with its fringe of black cliffs and surge-swept reefs on which innumerable seamen have met their end. And it just goes on. He says there were traces of some vanished race which had passed utterly away and left as its sole record strange monuments of stone, irregular mounds which contained the burned ashes of the dead, and curious earthworks which hinted at prehistoric strife. And then we soon find out that Holmes is there because the ancient Cornish language had also arrested his attention. And it was his idea that ancient language had been largely derived from the Phoenician tin traders.
What do we gather from this? I mean, we have a description of a language that no longer exists. We have descriptions of prehistoric dwellings that no longer exist, even villages of recent memory that are in somewhat ruinous decay, combined with Conan Doyle's earlier descriptions about the families that were ruined, an orphanage. It sounds like a depressing place.
Well, it's a place that's associated with many legends, and it's a wonderful setting. We got into this a bit in talking about Dartmoor and the Hound and the fact that you leave the city and you go to these magical places, which can be very Shakespearean. And it's happening here again in Cornwall. Cornwall is associated with many legends, and it has links with magic and witchcraft. There are people who believe that King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table inhabited the northeastern part of Cornwall. But, also when we first hear about the crime and what happened in this mysterious room with the death of these people, somebody, I think it's Mortimer Tregennis, cries out, it's devilish. It's not of this world. Something has come into that room which has dashed the light of reason from their minds. And, Cornwall does have a tradition of witchcraft, and it's something, the ancient stone circles. Conan Doyle must have been aware of that tradition, that thinking when he set the story here.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, it was certainly something of legend, not only locally, but certainly in a lot of literature as well. And I'm thinking, in particular, the 13th century story about Tristan and Isolde, which was told by certainly, in just in literature, but also in music. Probably most famously with Wagner. And, interestingly, this was used in the BBC radio production of the Sherlock Holmes stories. It was written in as part of the background music, haunting melodies. And when you think about what Tristan and Isolde was about, it was about star-crossed lovers. There was a love potion that was involved, something that would fog the brain. Not too dissimilar from what we're talking about with Devil's Foot route here, except there were obviously some tragic implications with, or some final implications with regard to the Devil's Foot. This notion of magic and the supernatural and other forces, perhaps from nature, perhaps from elsewhere, seems to be coming through when we hear about things happening in Cornwall.
Well, that's fascinating. I think that has if nobody's written about that has the basis of an interesting paper, the connections between those myths and legends and particularly the Wagnerian connection. I like that.
Yeah,
But you'll find in other literature, Cornwall turns up in works by Thomas Hardy and Wilkie Collins and Sabine Baring Gould and Bram Stoker. And it's for all of these reasons, the fact that, and Holmes relates a little bit of this. He says, you find comments in the story, things like, let's walk along the cliffs together in search for flint arrows. Well, you're looking for old flint tools, and devote the rest of our morning to the pursuit of Neolithic man. And that's the 2000 BC. That's the new Stone Age, and the traces of these people. Their stone huts, the standing stone circles, the burial mounds are all around in Cornwall.
Well, let's come back to Neolithic man just after we've had a chance right here to listen to Modern Man. Stay tuned. If you are a subscriber to the Baker Street Journal, that means every year you get not just the 4 quarterly editions, but you also get the Christmas Annual. And in 2020, the BSJ Christmas Annual is like no other. This time around, it is celebrating the 100-year adventure of the unique Hamlet, and it's edited by Richard Sveum. Now, if you're not familiar with the unique Hamlet, this is a short story that Vincent Starrett wrote. It was first published in 1920, and it's probably the most valuable Sherlock Holmes story that's not written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's a mix of Sherlockian and book-collecting satire, and it's an all-time favorite of many Sherlockians everywhere. The Unique Hamlet is a short story, but it first appeared as a separate booklet, and it was printed for a limited audience. This BSJ Christmas Annual will have the short story itself, plus tales from collectors from all around the world, as regards to the uniqueness of the unique Hamlet. The only way to get this is to be a subscriber of the Baker Street Journal. Go to BakerStreetIrregulars.com and ensure you can get the Christmas Annual today. We are back along the Cornish coast. Bert was just mentioning Neolithic man, the stone huts, and whatnot. This is really part of the fabric of Cornwall. We know that it's been inhabited since the Stone Age. It goes back to the Paleolithic era, but it really wasn't continuously occupied until maybe about 10,000 years ago during the I guess it would have been the Bronze Age and then the Iron Age. And this is when we begin to see trade happening between the Phoenicians, as mentioned before. Eventually the Romans conquer England, and that was really one of the last outposts of Roman occupation down there in Cornwall. It was even so remote and abandoned and spooky that they let the Romans keep it for as long as they did. So there's this evidence and evidence of history of occupation there. And I think particularly in the Granada series, when we see this story brought to life, they go on location and Holmes is there wandering among the monoliths. It seems like a more crude and ancient version of Stonehenge. It's obviously along the coast there, so it looks a little more battered, a little more sea-worn, but you have that same kind of, whether it's Celtic or Druid influence of, the monoliths and the various, stone huts or remains that are there.
It's true. And one of the lovely things about this subject and B, the case of the Devil's Foot, is how much information Watson packs into his report. And unfortunately, as you just mentioned when you referred to the various eras, Neolithic and Roman and so on, he pushes a lot of stuff together. So when he says, there were traces of some vanished race which had passed utterly away and left as its sole record strange monuments of stone, irregular mounds which contained the burned ashes of the dead, and curious earthworks which hinted at prehistoric strife. Well, it's lovely sentences here. But what happens is he sort of condensed 5,000 years into a couple of words here. So you have the Neolithic burial chambers, the standing stones and burial mounds, as you say, date from the Bronze Age. In the Iron Age, you get fortifications, and then the Romans, as you say. But boy, what a setting.
Watson had a way with words, and particularly with setting. And, you take this kind of combination of, remote and in some ways Gothic setting, combined with, Watson or Conan Doyle's, pen. And, it brings it to life. And like, we spoke about this with, Bert Coules, the head writer for the BBC radio series in, I believe episode 68 or 69. Those are back-to-back episodes. That when he took on the writing assignment for The Hound of the Baskervilles in particular, he viewed them more as one of the main characters. And I think that stands to reason here as well. Cornwall, the surroundings of Tredannick Wallace and the coastline and the monoliths, etc., all were a character in this story, a very prominent character that gave us a sense as to what was going on.
Yeah, it's true. It's a shame, though, that in Holmes's explorations of the ancient Chaldean language, which I think is completely unrelated to, what he was. I've read papers over the years about this. I think the answer here is that Chaldean is related to Aramaic and that the ancient Cornish language is related more to Welsh. But I'm no linguist, so don't take that to the bank. But it's a shame that in his researches, Holmes apparently didn't have more success.
True. Well, maybe it was a MacGuffin.
No, a MacGuffin is Hitchcockian, and that's completely a trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Why, it's wonderful, Holmes, wonderful. The views are spectacular. We're overlooking the most dangerous piece of coastline in the country.